Good morning. It's a good Lord's Day, a beautiful Lord's Day. It seems like the fall weather has finally come in, so it's cool and crisp out, and it's beautiful outside. And with fall coming around, we also have a lot of visitors among us, especially people who have come up from Florida College for their fall break. And so it's so good to see so many familiar faces among us. And we're glad that you get to be a part of this family this morning. And if you're visiting from anywhere else, we're so thankful that you're with us, whether you're joining us in person or through the live stream. We're so thankful that you're here and a part of us this morning on this great Lord's Day. But what makes this Lord's Day so special is not just the crisp, cool weather in the fall that has finally rolled in. It's not just that it's a packed building because of more visitors. The best part about this Lord's Day and about every Lord's Day is that God Himself is among us. And I believe that this morning, and I hope that you believe that this morning, because He has promised that, and we believe. If you would like, you can make your way in your Bible to Matthew chapter 25. We'll briefly kind of pick up there in a moment, but we've been working through a series. This is part 6 of our series called Win Your War Within. Win Your War Within. And we've been looking through what is sometimes called the 7 capital vices, the 7 deadly sins, sometimes it's called. And the one that we're focusing on in this lesson is acedia. Acedia. And you may be like me and have not heard this word before until I studied it for this lesson. But sometimes it's translated as sloth, or sometimes as apathy. But when we think about it as sloth, it kind of makes us think of maybe one of my favorite scenes from the movie Zootopia. Here, they're in this DPS office, which is notoriously slow, and it's run by sloths. And so it's slow and lethargic, and everything is just moving inch by inch, and it seems like it's just in slow motion. Nothing is getting done. And that's part of acedia. It's this laziness, this idleness, this slowness. That's part of it. But if that's all that it is, then we might wonder, well, what's so dangerous about this sin? What could be so bad about this sin of acedia? I mean, it's good to take it easy every once in a while. We like the sloth from Ice Age, Sid the Sloth. He's a pretty good guy. And so what could be so bad about this vice of acedia? Well, Jesus tells a story in Matthew chapter 25 that may help us understand what this word really means, what it really is, and just how dangerous of an effect it can have on our lives. And there in Matthew 25, you are familiar with the story. Around verse 14, we won't read through it, but in verse 14, he picks up with the story of the parable of the talents. And there you have a master who goes away on a journey, and he entrusts his servants, his stewards, with different sums of money that we call these talents. And he entrusts one with 5 and one with 2. And in the 5 and the 2, they go out and they double their portion. But then you remember what happens with the 1 talent man. He takes this portion, he takes his sum of money, and he buries it in the ground. And we don't know all the reasons why he may have done that. Perhaps it was just that he was just entirely lazy. He was that sloth. He was like that sluggard that is portrayed throughout the book of Proverbs. He was procrastinating. He put it off too long. Who knows all the reasons why? We know at least part of the reason is because he was afraid of the master. He knew the master to be a harsh man, but for whatever reason it was, he buries this talent. And so the master returns, and to the 2 and the 5 that have doubled their portion, he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." But then do you remember what he says to the 1-talent man? Do you remember what he says to the one who buried it? He turns and he answers this servant, "You wicked and slothful," there's our word, servant. "You wicked and slothful," or sometimes it's translated lazy servant. And we look at that and we might think at the start, that seems a little bit harsh. It seems like the master's coming down pretty hard here. But think about this. It says just before this that he gave to each of them according to their ability. He entrusted them with something not that was beyond their ability to fulfill. And what he entrusted them with was not something that was small or insignificant. It was a large sum of money. And so he gives them this responsibility. He trusts that they'll carry it out, that they'll use the resources that they've been given to bring about whatever vision the master had for his estate. And so to bury it is nothing short of wicked. To bury a resource in a responsibility that someone has entrusted to us is nothing short of wicked, and it certainly is lazy. And so he says to this servant, cast the worthless servant, and that is by definition what he is. He was given resources, he did nothing with it, he buried it in the ground. He was worthless. And he says, cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping, sorrow, sadness, and he says, gnashing of teeth. And I don't know what image comes to your mind when you think about the gnashing of teeth. I kind of think about the image of an animal who is gritting its teeth, who's snarling, and that's part of it. The idea of being angered. It's an expression of anger when we clench our teeth, or angry. But it's not just anger that's outward focused. It can be anger that is directed at your own self. Gnashing our teeth in regret for opportunities we've missed out on, for ways that we have failed, the frustration and the anger that we feel within us when we know that we're not what we could have been. And that's the place of this outer darkness. And it's a place that I think all of us are, at least in some ways, familiar with. Maybe not the outer darkness, but we've all been in that dark place where we are filled with the sorrow and the sadness and the shame and the regret and frustration and anger with ourselves over who we could have been, what we should have done, what we wish we would have happened, where we look back in regret and think, I missed it. And people find themselves in this place for all kinds of reasons. But I think that if I could put into words, the way that we feel is we just feel stuck. And the place that we feel stuck, I think, is this. We feel stuck between a self that we cannot bear and a self that we cannot bear to become. A self we cannot bear and a self we cannot bear to become. And this is where acedia thrives. Because this word, acedia, it's more than just laziness or idleness or slowness. That's certainly part of it. But the word itself, it literally means a lack of care. In fact, you can even hear it in the word. The word is akadia, without care. And that's what it is. It's a life that is lived without care, without purpose and intention and meaning and significance. It's this apathetic disposition toward the world and your place in it. And with this careless disposition, with this careless spirit that at times comes upon every one of us, we may find ourselves in the same spot as this worthless servant, where we ourselves feel worthless, and all we can do is gnash our teeth in anger at our own existence because we realize that we're stuck between the self we cannot bear and the self that we cannot bear to become. And people find themselves in this place for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's because we look back at our past and we have these failures that continue to weigh us down and trip us up and entangle us, and they're like these encumbrances that we just can't shake. Or sometimes it's something that's going on in the present where it seems just whatever is going on is too chaotic and too stressful and too difficult to do anything about the circumstances that I find myself in. Or sometimes it's maybe looking out at the future. And the future just seems so broad, and there's so many question marks, and there's so many unforeseen obstacles that may be out there or that I know that are out there. And I just feel like I can't progress forward knowing that there's so much left of this journey to go. And so we feel stuck between the self that we cannot bear and the self we cannot bear to become, the muddy middle ground between being and becoming. And that's what acedia is. And the good news is that you and I, we can still change that. We may have found ourselves in that dark place in the past. Some of us, maybe all of us, at least to some degree, find ourselves there this morning where we feel in that position where we're stuck in that middle ground between being and becoming, but we're not in the outer darkness. We're not in the outer darkness yet. We can still do something about this. And so what is it that we can do? Well, I think that the book of Hebrews helps us see the way out. And I don't want to set up too much of what we're about to read, but if you would like, you can make your way over to Hebrews. We'll begin in chapter 10, toward the end of that chapter. But as you make your way there to the book of Hebrews chapter 10, the book of Hebrews, as you might know, is all about the worth and the value and the supremacy of Christ above everything else. And it's written in some ways as kind of like a written sermon. And it's written, at least in some part, for the purpose of encouraging and admonishing and strengthening the people, the Christians of that day and time and region, to not, as he'll say in a moment, shrink back. To not give in, to not sink into that position of being stuck and idle. And one helpful way of remembering it is throughout the book of Hebrews, you'll see Jesus is and therefore let us. And so that's a good way to look throughout the book of Hebrews. Jesus is this, and because he is this, let us, whatever comes next. And so he gets toward the end of this sermon, and he says this, he says, "Yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." So right off the bat, what I want us to see is this is in some way just like this story of the parable of the talents. The master goes away, and the master who has gone away will come back and will not delay. And if we want to be pleasing to this master, he says we can't shrink back. And so he continues on and he says, but we are not of those who shrink back. We're not of those who shrink back to the outer darkness. We're not of those who shrink back to destruction, but we are of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. And this is where we start to find our answer, our solution to the problem of acedia. I could be like the person who shrinks back, who buries the resources that I've been entrusted with, who sits idly by as the sloth and sluggard, gnashing my teeth at my own existence. I could shrink back to destruction, or he says, I could be the kind of person who has faith. I could be the kind of person who has faith to, he says, the preserving of the soul. And so what is this faith? Well, he says in the next verse, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not yet seen. And in this statement, he's not laying forth a perfectly precise or comprehensive scholarly definition of the word. He's giving us a description of what faith is, especially in contrast with the one who shrinks back. And it's really two parts. It's the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And we won't break each of those statements down into their finite details, but what I want us to see is that faith is about vision. Faith is about vision. It's the thing that's hoped for. It's the thing that's not yet seen. It's that vision that's often in the future. Faith, maybe we could put it like this: faith envisions the future plans and promises of God and then moves toward them in full assurance and conviction to bring them into reality. And envisions the future plans and promises of God that he's revealed to us, and then moves toward them with every part of our being, advances and propels toward these promises to bring them into our present reality. And so that's this idea of faith, and this is huge. Because if acedia is about a lack of care, if it's about a lack of meaning or purpose or struggling to find value or any kind of motivation to move myself forward, then what you and I need to get unstuck from that is a cause that's worth caring in. If I'm gonna move from rolling over in my bed and continuing to hit snooze in life, then I need something. I need some kind of dream, some kind of purpose to get me out of bed and into action. If the problem is within myself, then something outside of myself has to be the thing that pushes me forward. In other words, we could perhaps put it this way: if we are to ever be unstuck, if we find ourselves stuck between the self that I cannot bear and the self that I cannot bear to become, the only way out is to be driven by a God-given vision. To be driven by a God-given vision. And this is why I think so many people and so many Christians struggle with this apathy and this perhaps lack of zeal and fervor and meaning. It's because we need to set our sight on a vision. We have to be driven by this God-given vision. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but I want us to see where the writer goes next. He begins in verse 2, he says, "For by this faith, by this vision, the ancients of old gained their approval," or I like the way that one version puts it, the ancients were witnessed of. And that may sound a little bit odd, a little bit strange to put it in that way. But perhaps we could think about it like this. We sometimes call Hebrews 11 the hall of faith. And as we walk down this hallway of the faithful, lining either side of these walls are the portraits of all these men and women, these ancient people of old. And as we walk down this hallway, what we would see when we look at their picture and we look at their lives, what we would see is not people who shrink back. The testimony that would cry out to their life would not be those who shrunk back, who sunk into a position of despair and apathy and idleness. Instead, when we look at their picture, what would cry out the loudest, what would witness to their life and testify the loudest would be their faith. It would be their vision for the future plans and promises of God that then move them forward to bring that into reality. That's what we would see in each of their lives. And so he gives us these examples. We walk down a ways and we see a man like Abraham. And you remember the story of Abraham there in Genesis 15. God comes to him in this sort of vision, and he says to Abraham in this voice, he says, look up at the heavens. Just last night, we were outside at a bonfire that I think actually several of you were at the Stinson's home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and looking up at the stars as we sung, it was so beautiful, these stars scattered across the sky. And imagine Abraham looking up at the heavens with the stars just dusted across the sky. And God says, if you can count the stars, so will your inheritance be, so will be your offspring. And it's not just about a big family. It's not just about the offspring itself. It's that through his offspring, God would fulfill the promises and the plans that he had from the very beginning of creation. That through his family, all the families, the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so with that vision in mind, Abraham, it says in Hebrews, he went out not even knowing where he was going. And along this journey of faith, he encountered all kinds of unimaginable obstacles and difficulties and challenges along the way, but he kept pressing forward. And why was that? Why did he continue to advance forward? Well, it was because he was driven by that vision. Hebrews says that he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He was driven by this vision. Or we go down a little bit further and we come across someone like Moses. And we're familiar with his story too, and it seems like Moses from the very beginning was captivated by this vision. And we don't know exactly how it may have come to him. Perhaps his mother, Jochebed, when she was still able to look after him, when he was adopted into Pharaoh's house. Perhaps his Israelite mother was able to tell him about the promises to Abraham. How the people of Israel that were enslaved in Egypt would one day enter into that promised land. But however it came to him, he's gripped by it from, it seems, a very early age, and it moves him to action, right? He strikes the Egyptian expecting that he would initiate this revolution and lead the charge into the promised land, but what happens? Well, nobody follows. And so he's forced to flee to Midian, and as he flees to this wilderness, that vision that he once had that captivated him is now dormant, as he's just this shepherd. But after some time, God then appears to him in this burning bush, and he reinstates that vision in the mind of Moses. And with that vision restored and refined and refocused in his life, he then takes up the charge and he leads the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness and all the obstacles and difficulties and challenges that were a part of this journey and to the edge of the promised land. And what was it that motivated him throughout that? Well, it says in Hebrews that he feared him who was unseen, that he was awe-inspired by the Creator that had reinstated that vision in him in the moment of the burning bush, and he was driven by this vision. Or we read about people like Rahab. And her story is much shorter, but it is just as amazing. A woman, a harlot, who certainly felt stuck between a self that she could not bear and a self that she could not bear to become, but she had a vision. she heard about the God of the Israelites that were making their way with the people of Israel out of Egypt and through the land of Canaan. And she heard about this God who was infinitely powerful, but who used his power to free a nation of slaves, to free a people who were oppressed, to free a people who were looked down on by society and used by society and abused by the nation of Egypt. And he used his power to free those people, to free people just like herself. And perhaps it started as just this dream, this wishful thinking about escaping the life that she was trapped in within those walls of Jericho, to start over again. But what began as a dream became a reality when those spies came and knocked on her door. And Hebrews 11 says she welcomed the spies in peace. And as she attached herself to the people who had aligned, a nation of people who had aligned their vision with God's vision, she then became a part of the lineage of the Son of God himself. And the Hebrew writer goes on to describe many other people of David and Samuel and all these other people of faith. And he says, time would fail me to list all of the people who had this perspective, who continued in faith. But the thing that ties them all together is that they were driven by that vision. They were driven by that God-given vision. And so, what is that for you? What is your vision? Because as we look at these stories and we think about how to overcome apathy in this place where we find ourselves stuck between the self we cannot bear and the self that we cannot bear to become, like we already mentioned, the only way out is to find that purpose that drives us forward, to be driven by that God-given vision. And for some of these men and women, for some of these ancient people, that vision came to them by some miraculous experience, a voice in the night, a burning bush, a mountaintop experience. But for others, it came by other means, by a story that was retold throughout generations, by a message that was within a scroll of parchment that was inscribed with the promises of God of old, the ancient words that they believed were ever true, that were changing me and you and this whole world. And so what is that for us? And while these people had perhaps many different ways of coming to this vision, I think what all of them reveal to us is a pattern. And it's a pattern that shows us how we can discover our God-given vision. It shows us how in our day, in our time, they reveal a pattern for how we can discover this vision. And that pattern, I think, is this. It's to look into the revelation of God to see the way things should be, and then to look out into our reality and envision the way things could be. And this is what their examples show us. All of them show us this pattern of being so dissatisfied with the way things were, so uncomfortable with the world that they were living in compared to what they knew God desired it to be and intended it to be, that it drove them to bring the promises of God into their reality. It moved them to action in the relentless pursuit of bringing God's future promises into our world today. They were driven by this vision. And so what is your vision? When you look out at the world, or you look out at the world of your home or your community or your school or your team or your workplace or family or your friend group, when you look out at these spheres of influence in your life, what strikes you as a stark contrast between the way things are and the way things could be? What strikes a chord within you in realizing the reality of the world around you compared to what God intended it to ultimately become? What changes do you see need to be made? What needs to improve? What bothers you or perhaps even angers you because you realize it's not the way that God meant for it to be? What do you notice that's in dissonance with what God desires? Because that is where we find our vision. That's where we find the purpose that propels us forward from being stuck in acedia, in sloth and apathy. And the more clearly that I can answer those kinds of questions, the clearer that vision becomes. And the clearer that vision becomes, the more and more I am moved with all of my being to pursue it to its end and to see its fulfillment in our world today. And that vision, it may look different for every person. Surely it will look different for every person. But I know a couple deacons who at the height of COVID looked out at a church that was fractured and fragmented and struggling along as we were torn apart, who decided that they would try to take it upon themselves to find some way to keep us together, to keep us united. And so they started a podcast where they had members on and were able to stay connected through a time of immense trial and difficulty for everyone, where unity was crucial. Or I know a high school senior who looked out at a community that was in desperate need of prayer and the will of God to be accomplished. And so she took it upon herself to turn a space in her community into a whole prayer garden where anyone from the community could come to and to rally together in prayer to the Lord. Or I know a family. I met a family this past summer who during 2020, a time where there was racial tension and where they looked out at a system of foster care that was broken and dismantled and so many problems with it. They looked out at the brokenness of that and decided, is there anything we can do? Because this is not the way that it's supposed to be. This is not the way that the world is meant to be. It's not what God promised to ultimately come about. And so they looked out at that reality and said, is there anything we can do? And so during COVID, in a time where they were able to have more time with family than normal, they took inventory of what they had. Like the 2 and the 5 talent people, that they looked at the resources that they had and they said, what is it that God has placed in our hands and in our hearts that we can use to bring about His plans and vision for the world? And so looking at the resources that they had, they decided to begin a foster home within their house. They saw the stability that they were blessed with in their home and the love that existed within it, and they thought maybe we can play some small part in the children that come under our influence in the short time that they have here, and do something to further the vision that God has for His creation. And there are many examples, perhaps examples that you think of, people that you know who were inspired and driven by a vision. But what is that vision for you? Because I believe that that's where the writer goes next. He speaks of all these great men and women, all these examples of old, and perhaps examples that we can think of today. And then he says, and what about us? What about you and me? And this is where the writer drives it home. He says in Hebrews 12 in verse 1, therefore, as we look at all of these faithful witnesses, this cloud of witnesses, he says, that is surrounding us, let us also, like them, lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And this is, in part, our problem, our challenge, right? We find ourselves stuck between the self that we cannot bear and the self that we cannot bear to become, not because we desire to be there, although sometimes we make that into our comfort zone. But we don't find ourselves in that muddy middle ground between being and becoming because we just desire to exist there eternally. No, we want the way out, but what happens is we have these encumbrances. We have the things that weigh us down, our past, our present, our future. We have things that entangle us and trip us up and keep us back from pursuing that end. But it's not just the encumbrances or the entanglements, it's the endurance, right? It's the daily grind, the daily wear and tear of moving forward in this journey and not allowing myself to shrink back. And so how do we do that? How do we push forward? Well, he says it's to look to what's set before us. And this is what he's been saying all along, right? This is what we've been driving at all along. The way out of being stuck between the self I cannot bear and the self I cannot bear to become is to be driven by that vision. That's the goal that he's communicating to us. To run with endurance toward what is set before us. The future plans and promises of God, just like all these ancient people of old. But as we do that, what lies before us is not just a promise, it's a person. He says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith. Other versions say the founder and the finisher of our faith, who, he says, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And here's what I want us to see this morning. This whole section actually starts with the vision of God. In Hebrews 11, verse 6, it says, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. So he begins all of this with creation. In the world, in that moment, it's formless and void and dark, but God has a vision. He envisions what it could be, and he brings light out of darkness. He brings being out of potential and order out of chaos, and he brings that into a reality of the creation that we have today. And so he brings this being into potential, and then he sets mankind over his good creation, to have dominion over it, to keep it, to guard it, to cultivate it, to bring goodness out of it. And it says to fill the earth and subdue it. It's to carry out God's vision of a good world, to continue the vision that he started in the moment of creation. And he entrusts them with that. He entrusts them with this incredible responsibility of the resources of a world that is packed full of potential, and to bring that into being just as he did so in the very beginning. But they lose sight of that vision. And just as the world seems to be shrinking back into darkness, the ancient people of old come along and they restore that vision. They bring it back into focus. People like Abraham and like Moses and like Rahab and like David and like so many other people that we read of, they bring that vision back into focus and they carry that vision out just a little bit further. But Hebrews says that all these died in faith, having not received the promise. And so it's like they carried this cause a little bit further. They carried out that vision for the world and the way God intended it to be just a little bit further. But it never came to its fulfillment. And none of them carried it out perfectly until Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, the new Adam. And his whole life was driven by that God-given vision. Leaving his homeland in heaven, coming into a world and meeting unimaginable challenges. Never shrinking back into apathy, never shrinking back and sinking into a place where he's stuck in sloth or sluggishness or acedia or idleness. But with every ounce of his being, with every moment of his existence, he's moving toward the plans and the purposes of God and bringing that into reality. And it drives him with this zeal, a zeal that's so fervent and so powerful in controlling in his life that it consumes him. It leads him to the cross where he despises the shame and he sits down at the right hand of God. And as Jesus, as the author and perfecter of our faith, arose from that ultimate darkness of death and ascended into heaven where he's at the throne of God on high, he initiated a new creation. He says to the disciples just before he ascends to that right hand of the throne of God, go into all the world, fill the earth, make disciples of all the nations. He entrusts them with this vision that he began. And it's the vision that drove the apostles. It's the vision that drove Paul. It's the vision that was the fuel in the fire of the church. It's a vision that's been carried out for 2,000 years and down to us today. And we know that to be true, but sometimes it is so easy to shrink back and to forget that. And a passage like Ephesians 2:10 reminds us that we are his workmanship, created anew in Christ Jesus for good works which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. We are created anew in Christ to be his eyes in the world, to be his hands that serve and his feet that move into the place between the way things are and the way things could be and should be, and the shoulders that bear whatever burden it is to bring that about, to bring the future plans and promises of God into our present reality. And so we're familiar with this. We know that we're to be the light of the world, the city set on a hill. And I believe that's why many of you, and I hope all of you, are here this morning, because we believe in that vision. But when we find ourselves shrinking back, when we find ourselves stuck in acedia and apathy, when we find ourselves in this spiritual stalemate, it can be so easy to forget the cause that we're fighting for. We can forget what it is that we've been entrusted with, this amazing privilege and responsibility of carrying out Christ's vision for the world. And so we don't have to be stuck in that middle ground between being and becoming, where sloth and acedia and idleness thrive in our lives and keep us back. When we feel stuck between the self that we cannot bear and the self that we cannot bear to become, we can fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. And we can fix our eyes on the plans and the promises that God has for this world and move with every part of our being to bring those into reality in the world around us. If you're here this morning and you want to join in that vision, if you want to begin that journey, if you want to be created anew in Christ, to be His workmanship, to be His hands and feet that carry out His vision for the world, then we hope that you'll come and commit your life to Him in baptism and be washed anew and to be recreated. Or if you have lost sight of that vision and there's some way that we together can help you regain that focus and push forward in that effort, then we would love nothing more than to be able to pray with you and over you and to unite together to continue what God began at creation and what He is continuing to the day of eternity, the vision that He has for us. If you want to join in that right now, please come now as we stand and as we sing.